Oh, okay. So yesterday, based on, and then I'm going to have to unpack all of this, but based on the following, and the following are not necessarily a linear string, but they are definitely some kind of synchrony of communicative experiences. All right. So yesterday, based on the fact of what we created, and which involved a number of different ways of seeing as. And the piece that we created yesterday involved certain kinds of distinctions or sortings or classifications. And the model for those classifications was binary, right? And that, that binary division of the world into this sort of objects and that sort of objects is clearly always already an over reduction, but that relates to certain kinds of procedural protocols that have to do with the way that the mind clarifies simple objects in space and time. And that's probably why Wittgenstein liked these visual puzzles, not because he was obsessed or overly interested in the phenomenon of the mechanics of the way that the brain perceives, but because in the mechanics of the way that the brain perceives as figure and ground, or in terms of metaphor, the way that in metaphor, one of the elements of the metaphor can be seen as referring to the representation of the other. In other words, if I say that man is a hedgehog, presumably the figure is the hedgehog, and the ground is the man. In other words, I'm not ambiguating the relationship between the man and the hedgehog. I'm using the figural representation of the hedgehog to represent, either a fictional or real man. And even if that man is fictional, his ontological stability is still greater than that of the hedgehog, which is always already merely figurative, right? Okay, so, that having been said, that's one of the elements that occurred yesterday. And then another element is that using the observations of images and of videos placed on the YouTube channel, there may or may not have been a communication back, and based on observations of other pages on YouTube that I frequently look at and communicate with in subtle ways, that there may have been a communication back, provided that. Now, that we need to say there may or may not have been creates another interesting ambiguity or ambiguation that generally doesn't exist, or we don't perceive in communication systems. And I want to make this really obvious by taking a look at Roman Jakobson's model for functions of language in communication systems, right? So here are the elements, the 6 elements that Jakobson identifies, right? Okay, so we have a sender in the instance of a piece of mail. It's whoever wrote this letter. Let's just say that it is a letter. Someone wrote a letter and sent it to someone else. Well, these entities are clearly identifiable identifiable in these communication systems. The context would be, for example, if the letter, concerns democracy in America, the context, and it was sent yesterday, the context could be the situation in which we're living in right now, in which many people's voting rights are being are being threatened and diminished, right, by both by legislation and by disinformation that's produced, both by the right-wing media and by individuals acting in the service of what was once a democracy. The message, consists of what this entity wants to send to this entity. That's why probably this is the center. Sometimes we imagine that the elements external are what would you say, transparent in the message, and they're not necessarily so. This is interesting. Channel, I don't really know that Jakobson uses this word. I suppose it's possible to translate the Russian to channel, but really, I think that what he uses is contact. So the channel is, on the immediate, physical level, the paper or the pen, the way that the message is materialized, but also in this case, because it's sent, the channel would involve the postman, right? And we've just, kind of in an oblique way been referring to, the time channel as well as the physical space channel of the contact, right, of the message. And the code is, the shared set of references that are required, not only just that the letter be written in the same language, but the idioms of the language are accessible to both the sender and the receiver. The historical context that the message relates to within, are accessible to both of these individuals, all right, or entities. So that's an idealized model. Now, in space-time communication systems, if observation is indeed communication and numbers refer to a set of data that can be interpreted, via the elements of this system, the sender and the receiver are already ambiguated. I'll just use the word ambiguated, or become a kind of ambiguous figure. In other words, say that I go to the front page of my channel and I take the numerical values here, 2, 4, 5. Let's just say it's 24 and 5. All right, so 24 can be translated into this set, this Steve Hillage playlist set, which is a set of sets, right? Because it contains multiple sets of playlists within it. Now, in this case, the reason that it's up here and the reason that it is a set of sets is because I, in purchasing these examples that fall within the set of Steve Hillage that I'm interested in, I only purchased partial sets. Now, this is a partial set of the set that belongs to this album, Fish Rising. This is also a partial set of the pieces that belong to the album Green. This is a partial set of Live in England, and this is a partial set of Madison Square Garden 1977. All right, so this set, Steve Hillage, is a set of sets of which sets, the last set of sets, are partial, okay? And if I take, right, if I take the numerical values on the front page, the observations of those videos, as the code for a communication coordinate, and I come here, and that's number 24. So the 24 brings us here, and 5 brings us to this particular communication coordinate activation meditation. Now I could take this as a random event and ignore it, and fail to regard it as an act of communication. But because I've set up this system as an intentionality and expressed that it can be used in such a way, there's an ambiguity, right? So that brings us back to the instability of the ambiguous figures. I could take it as a random condition of the fact that there will be numbers, either the presence of numbers or the absence of numbers. In other words, people will or will not view these videos, and so there will either be no views or there will be some number of views, and that's just a ineluctable materiality of the visible, right? That they will either be perceived or not perceived. But because I have articulated the possibility of an intentionality lying within the perception, an ambiguity arises. Was there a message or was there not a message? So going back to Jakobson's functions, there may or may not be a sender within those numbers, and this entity becomes ambiguous. It becomes ambiguous in another way, because even if I choose to render those numbers as a message, and that they were necessarily created by an intending subject, identifying that intending subject is still difficult within the system, because if the message isn't encoded, right, with a self-identification the way it generally is in a piece of mail, you sign your name or you have a return address, but I just received activation meditation here, right? So in what way does activation meditation also refer to the sender of the message? Or is the identification hidden or masked? Again, questions of ambiguity arise, and in terms of Jakobson's model, this is already ambiguous. The message is also ambiguous. The context is, I'm assuming, related to what I began talking about, the fact that yesterday we created a piece that talks about or that explores ideas of ambiguous images and different kinds of binary sortings of conceptual and material aspects of the world, and brings those two things together in some interesting ways, and compares and contrasts these metastructures of comparing, contrasting, and perceiving, right? So all of that's going on, and I'm assuming that activation meditation has a relationship to the last piece that we did yesterday, which is itself ambiguous. And I'm choosing to regard this message not in terms of a direct response to the piece Critical Ambiguous Figure Drawing 1600, but rather as a way. So already some intuition and some selection is being made on my part in interpreting this. But I'm taking activation meditation, if it is in fact a message, which is not clear at all, as being activate some communication back in relationship to a message that's being sent. And that move of interpretation is not, in any way, shape, or form, stable, and it doesn't represent, a kind of one-to-one correspondence model communication that even in the Jakobson, we still find some degree of certainty and stability in each of these elements that clearly have become recontextualized in terms of space-time travel coordinate systems, and all of the ambiguities that are given rise to when the identity of the sender is highly questionable, whether in fact it is being received is questionable. The message is open to multiple pathways of exploration through the various elements that are represented here in the blue, and that whether in fact it even is an intentionality or a random event, right? Like it could be completely aleatory, right? That somebody found this channel not knowing that it involves space-time communication coordinates and this particular understanding of observation as communication in the post-Einsteinian universe and von Neumann universe in which it exists somehow simultaneously, and someone looked at these videos and these images without having any intention of communication. Now that gives rise to another set of questions. If indeed that happened and there wasn't a single individual or set of individuals involved in the construction of sending a message and the understanding that a message was being sent, can we still read the message as message? Can we still say, using Jakobson's model, that some ghost in some machine or some set of ghosts in some set of machines operated within this basic system of the 6 elements of the functions of language in communicating this message? Now, what would that entail? Now, what if none of that is really going on? There are no ghosts and there are no machines external to the space-time travel communication system that we devised. You can still imagine that some subset of the receiver is a set or extra dimensional set of the sender, or sub extra dimensional set of the receiver, right? Sending the message to itself. In other words, even if there was no external world in the von Neumann post-Einsteinian universe, which space-time travel communication systems constructed, I could be reasonably sending a message to myself as a subset of entities within myself that were unaware of the dynamics in which context, message, channel, code, right, were involved in the construction of this course, of this path of information from this partial set to this either partial set or this multiplicity of sets, right? Okay, so one way or another, having devised the system as an act of communication, we've created some kind of model of communication, even if Jakobson's strict division into these 6 elements has been thoroughly complicated by it. In other words, by seeing as, right, by seeing what might have been regarded as merely chance, aleatory, a throw of the dice, by seeing it and envisioning it as a system of communication, we have effectively made it so. And in making it so, it's somewhat irreversible. In other words, and I've found that the more that I talk about this particular construction of a contract in phi through theta's YouTube channel, the more hesitant people are to actually view the videos. And I think it's because of this sort of ineluctable modality of the communicative, right? A recognition that, and here we have a 16, which could be, if we add 2 zeros to it, 1600. Or if we reorganized these units, could be either 91 or 19, if 1600 were 1900, it seems to refer to. And we have certain kinds of reversible letters that are, presumably inscriptions written on the other side of the page that are here, visible through the not transparency but translucent pages of this this apparently very old volume. So I think that hesitance to view is an implicit, at least I'm regarding it as such, an implicit understanding that there's a certain amount of responsibility in making a communication, or someone doesn't want to make a communication that is merely arbitrary and random, but rather that belongs to that subject, right? So I'm taking activation meditation not as the terminus of the message and the totality of the message, but a relationship that the message has to an intention toward a communication back. In other words, please, I'm taking it as the descriptor, please respond to a message.
Okay, so let's just say that then that space-time communication coordinate, activation meditation, was one element of a complex message, or a complex set of interconnected messages that I'm going to respond to that, may or may not have been intended, and may or may not have belonged to a single entity as a sender, right? Or may have belonged to a multiplicity, in the same way that, Aaron and a contract in phi through theta are multiplicities and belong to a larger set of multiplicities. So, and I'm not going to say, where, but using space-time travel communication coordinates, I've located in some space-time another message which belongs to this particular coordinate, lupus. And even this word, lupus, has to be interpreted, via the context of the set in which it occurs, because this word could mean a number of different things. But it occurs in this context within the set called the equatorial stars. So we interpret this word and all of the semantic connotations and denotations around this word within this particular context. And going back to Jakobson, we find that, this oversimplified model, but nevertheless useful model, contains as an element within it, this idea of context. Now, had we not done that, had we not understood, the role of context in relationship to this particular word, we could have, or had we ignored the context of its designation within this set, we could have traveled elsewhere. But we're going to travel, in terms of our understanding, within the context of the equatorial stars. And so, to make sense of this as a message in relationship to this piece, the first thing that I did was I transposed it or transcribed it or allowed myself to move within another set of denotations. Well, really only denotations if one has access to this information, but as a movement from that set, that communication set, lupus, the equatorial star, I made an association with its spectral type, because it interested me that its spectral type could easily, be regarded as a space-time communication coordinate. And its spectral type is B1.53. And so I translated the B1 into 21 and the 5 into the fifth set within 21, and the 3 as a designator within that fifth set. And if we go back up to the usual palm tree space-time communication coordinate set, we find that this set, this recently added set, and I'll talk about these two sets a little bit later because they're special sets within these sets of sets that require some further discussion in relationship to mutability and change and time. That the other sets don't participate with. All right, so the coordinate 21 brings us here, and then within that coordinate, these are recently added sets, and the reason that some of these have images and some of them don't is because some of them I made, and I don't have the algorithm, and the computer doesn't have access in what I create in GarageBand to a set of images unless I give those set of images a name which constitutes a value which it can assign an image to. So I tend to leave that blank because I don't want to misinform it. In other words, if I put, for example, I'm trying to remember what it was, but I don't think it's a contract in phi through theta, but if I use a name like Aaron, some image from some musician or set of musicians named Aaron will randomly attach itself to each of these sets, and since that musician that algorithm or that operation recognizes is not the Aaron I'm referring to, I try to avoid that, and I don't have icons for the various nominalizations that I create around each of these. Anyway, so these are made by various entities called. This is a nominalization that can be used to refer to me, and so is this is another set of the designation we or I, and often they'll be listed as a contract in phi through theta. All right, so the fifth set, and just to go back and confirm that we're looking for the number 5 is here, and that's a piece that a contract in phi through theta made called co-elaborations. All right, and so. Using, please respond to this message, activation meditation, and this message, which, I'm not stipulating where it was sent from. So if we go back up to Jakobson, a sender has a location or, a loci, and that's variable depending on time, right? And variable depending on a lot of other things, whether that loci is metaphorical, virtual, material, and this is already, in other words, the loci that belongs to this entity is already a multiplicity. That's clear, right? So I haven't specified, what either virtual or material loci my assumed correspondent belongs to, and I won't for the purposes here because then we get into a lot of further complications that will slow us down in the direction that we're going. But anyway, this location, right, communicated this location and set of significative acts of communication sent or didn't send through various organizations of the construct of interpretation. A message identifiable as lupus that I interpreted a fragment of to arrive here, and then using the last segment of that information 3 and the set of information that was sent from a different space-time position, right? So if we go back up to Jakobson, because lupus was sent from one space-time locus, and because activation meditation was sent from another space-time locus, the likelihood that the sender is already a set or composite of intelligent entities sending messages is greater than it would be if the message was sent from the same location. You follow what I'm saying? In other words, because I conjoined a message in one space-time location, activation meditation, with a message sent from another space-time location, lupus, the likelihood that this intelligent entity intentionally sending a message from two different space-time coordinates at the same time constitutes a single entity is less than it would be if the entirety of the message was sent from the same loci, right? All right, so the likelihood that this particular constellation, right, involves a coordinated set that in one way or another, like, involves a feedback loop, right, in the perception and interpretation of its destination, a contract in phi through theta, is greater than it would be if, say, I went to the mailbox. I don't have a mailbox. Well, I do have a mailbox, but it's not, it's not, it's not easily accessible. But if I went to the mailbox, which is not easily acceptable, and I opened it, and there was a letter, and it was addressed from someone, and it was addressed to me, right? Then I could say that, the likelihood that it's actually like a composite set of entities sending the information decreases because, insofar as I trust the information on the letter and it identifies a single subject as its source, then I can identify that single subject as minimizing, the likelihood of its von Neumann extra dimensional group sets, right? All right, now, turn to the page. The way that I responded to the two coordinate sets, co-elaborations, right, which I derived from the spectral type of lupus, and activation meditation, which I interpreted as please respond to this message, I did respond to the message. I responded by putting up a piece on the front page that's called Co-Elaborations 3, right? And so that created a new space-time coordinate, right here, 6 and 2, that I'm not going to interpret at this point because of limitations in time, but that involves this piece. Now, this piece is interesting because it's Aaron, and he's basically using a model for the way that Rorschach tests are interpreted as code in two different spacetimes. And the way that the interpreter of the Rorschach test interprets those codes is that there's an initial moment in which the psychological subject responds to the Rorschach test. Now, and these Rorschach-looking things above Aaron are not in any way, shape, or form Rorschachs. They are mirror symmetry images of the elements in the Kuleshov experiment that's generally referred to as the Kuleshov effect. And this was an early Soviet film, sort of a cinematic grammar experiment in which the interpretations of objects within cinematic representation were analyzed using the data from an experiment in which subjects were asked to interpret images in relationship to montages. So the same individual, was presented looking at, and there were a number of different things, a plate, the representation of a child in a coffin, a woman, and I think something else that I'm forgetting, and the subject. Here's the subject, and he would glance at these things, and then the montage would allow the audience, the observing subject, to under the grammar of the montage, believe that the man whose image first appeared in the first shot was looking at, right, perceiving, looking at, seeing the next object, whatever that was, the woman, the plate, etc., etc. And then the subject of the experiment was asked to define, in the final shot, the man's expression, what he was feeling. And projections were made so that when the montage said that he was looking at the dead child, the expression was perceived as sadness or despair. The expression was perceived as desire. Sometimes when he was looking at the woman, or depending on the subject's relationship to women, anger perhaps, or whatever that might be. Hopefully, it was something gentle and endearing. And onwards, with the plate, because it was a plate and there was no food in it. Perhaps the man looked hungry. All right, so this is about, right, connections between the imagery and the psychological subject, and it was created as a grammar by Kuleshov so that the language of cinema, could become a language and an understanding of the way that editing and the other elements of the cinematic apparatus could be used to create, complex representations, complex mimetic representations of the world, rather than, abstract representations. And the Rorschach test is basically the same thing. It imagines that what the psychological subject puts there is an experience of the psychological subject's inner world, and says something about the psychological subject, not what belongs to the objective material reality of the Rorschach image itself. And so what Aaron is doing is he's reading a sort of a von Neumann universalized poetics, or poetic von Neumann universe, use of sets to create a new model but based on the way that these Rorschach tests are actually interpreted, a new model of these two moments in time. And the two moments in time are the moment in when the psychological subject, interprets the Rorschach, and then the moment in which the interpretation that the psychoanalyst or the interpreting subject, provides, is brought back to the psychological subject, and the psychological subject is re-questioned. And these two moments are both important in the interpretation of the Rorschach test. And there's a kind of I'm looking for what I'm looking for. I'm looking for this image, because there's a kind of very elaborate classification system in the interpretational code. I'm going to turn that off so that Aaron's not talking in the background. There's a very elaborate system in the interpretation, right, and that's used in the interpretation of Rorschach tests, and that's what Aaron is reading, and it relates in very many ways to what we created yesterday. And the fact that it relates, and even references, so what we responded to, and the way that we interpreted the messages, even though they came from different space-time coordinates, the fact that they are messages related to what we understood them to be related to, the context of time, right? Context of time is very important. So if I'm speaking, and the last word that I used was dog, and even if it's even if it's a diminished reference, and someone, in responding to what I said in the next sentence, refers to a dog out of context, the context of the spoken word, dog, brings, what might have been.
So for example, if I just said, no, that image is intended to be of a fox, not of a dog, and then the individual that I was communicating, or the entity, to whom I was communicating that message, responded back, did you feed Leo today? Even though that sentence appears to be a non sequitur, in relationship to my utterance, psychologically it doesn't represent a non sequitur, because the context in which I utilized the word dog, even though I was clarifying that this in fact is a fox and not a dog, gives rise to a set of values that the psychological subject responds to in relationship to the experience of that psychological subject's own word. Dog reminded me of my dog, reminded me that I'm in doubt as to whether that dog was properly cared for today, and want to clarify that in as a kind of digression within the act of communication. So it's digressive, but it's not a non sequitur, and the reason that it's not a non sequitur belong to the realm of experiential memory, and this, and denotations and connotations within the larger set of values that single word dog have, and the way that the psychological subject interacts with that word, right, to form meaning in active communication. All right, so in terms of my response with collaborations 3, what's interesting is that I chose collaborations 3 as a response to the communicative values lupus and activation meditation. Not only because do its coordinates fit B1.53, but and I'll demonstrate this, but because of the context values within this particular piece that relate it to the immediate space-time context in which I'm assuming any message would be referring to. So collaborations 3, if you type that into the search, co-elaborations 3, and this is going to give me trouble because it's going to want to say collaborations, and it's going to want to autocorrect. See, it auto-corrected. Now I have to go back. I knew that it was going to do that, but there's almost nothing I can do to make it stop. Let's see if it'll stay now. All right, and you'll see that I actually had some options here because we have several co-elaborations 3, right? So I didn't have to choose this one, and I didn't have to select as a communicative response to the union, or the intersection, depending on how you look at it, of the sets lupus and activation meditation. I didn't have to select this piece, even based on this denotational value B1.53 and my choice to respond to that value. I could have, even using that value, I could have responded to any one of these with any one of these pieces. And the reason that I did so, once again, and this is an example from a different. I'll turn it up. A different co-elaborations 3. Okay, this is an infinity mirror, and then within that, these are images from one of the Asylum notebooks that relate back to a piece called Acts, a very long, extensive piece. And within that piece, a subset of that work, Acts, was a notebook I kept while spending time in what I referred to sort of literarily as asylum. In fact, a hospital ward, because more and more the term asylum isn't recognized as a part of our social experience, even though. So these are all images from this particular asylum notebook that were distributed in a number of different ways across different sets of work, including as illustrations for a long poetic piece that I did called The Labyrinth of Visions and other things. But basically, this has to do with the construct of this notebook and how I wanted to utilize this notebook that I made, utilizing limited resources from what was available around the house as a reconstruction of some of these notebooks that I kept. And then, of course, it's set to music. And that music is a piece, called Madness by Miles Davis. And the reason that I chose, this particular track by Miles Davis is multiple and various, as most reasons are. But the simple reason is because that madness relates to the idea of the asylum. Obviously, not merely in its connotational values, but in its denotational value as a word representing insanity. And these were examples of these images that I kept. Confined in this particular institution, and doing this piece about confinement in institution and about sorting and the way that the social construction of mental illness in our society sorts and confines. And these notebooks were explorations of all of that, and so recreating them, I wanted something that that worked with that particular set of values. And it didn't occur to me that in some ways. Well, let's say that. Let me back up from that sentence and re-articulate it. when I gave the example about why did you feed Leo today is not really a non sequitur in the discourse. That's intended to be a fox, not an image of a dog. It appears to be either someone paying lack of paying attention to the discourse, or some kind of speech error on the larger discursive level, or on the narrative level, rather than on the morphological or phonemic level. But in fact, it's not a non sequitur because that word dog, in relationship to a larger context of experience, is a mnemonic and a reminder of the real world situation that belongs both to the sender and the receiver. However, in this instance, responding with this particular piece, because of its lack of internal contextual references, and internal semantic and semiotic dialectic with the piece that I put up yesterday, would have in fact been a communicative non sequitur, and would merely have related to the synchrony of collaborations 3 and this particular spectral type. And in that sense, it would have been a loose connection, right? In the way that the psychological construct of it's not represented here, but psychological construct of loose connection is generally defined. Let's see if we can do a search for it. Which is to say that in the use of space-time travel communication coordinates, connections that are either meta-referential or intra-meta-referential are stronger connections and are more discursively relevant than others that are not arbitrary, because an intention towards communication has still been made, but not significatively discursive, right? So if I had chosen as a response this particular video, it would not be significatively discursive and not as relevant, right? And let's see if we resulted in anything with loose connection. Oh, that doesn't do me very good. Doesn't do much for us here. Let's see. This connection is an electrical connection. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for the psychological phenomenon of loose connection. Anyway, there are, I can't find anything of any particular relevance, and it doesn't really matter. But loose connection is, among that set of verbal and thought, disorders that belong to certain categories that are perceived as operations of abnormal psychology, such as word salad is another term that's often utilized. And all right, so let's go back to this. So there's a difference between throw of the dice, random, and intentionality towards communication, even though within intentionality towards communication, once it's been made in a complex system, each of these terms become ambiguous, but they don't disappear, right? And they have a different set of functional values than you would have if you merely threw the dice and you didn't understand that the results of the dice throw would invariably be perceived as a semiotic function, right? All right, so you can, and observations within space-time system coordinates are not, throws of the dice. They are definable. They might be difficult to define, but they're definable. And so they give rise to options. And this option was rejected for reasons of lack of significant discursive clarity or discursive elaboration, since we're using the idea of co-elaboration, right? Lack of discursive elaboration in terms of the elements of the discourse, particularly the context of the utterance, but also aspects of all these other elements as well, but particularly in terms of the context of the utterance as belonging to that first set of information in that conjoined representation of ambiguous figures and these ideas of classification, these binary classifications of this or that. And I could go through the rest of them, as well, and explain why I didn't choose this collaboration 3, or well, this one's collaboration 1, so I wouldn't have chosen that. But I could also talk about why I didn't choose this one, but I'm not going to, because having discussed why I didn't choose this one is enough, and you can you can transfer all of the information about why I didn't choose this one to why I didn't choose this one. One of the things that that all of that explanation does in relationship to the understanding of the initial piece, and the communication back, is clarify and articulate, certain, rationales and reasons for bringing together the idea of ambiguous figures and these classifications, these symbolic classifications of the world. Now, in this case, the Isaiah Berlin is a classification of the symbolic significance of these two creatures, the hedgehog and the fox, in relationship to psychological types, and what it does is it divides individuals into two groups. Those individuals who know many things but not necessarily in depth, and those individuals who know one big thing. And then you can divide the world in that way. Now, just like Wittgenstein's use of the ambiguous figure, you can almost say that this way of organizing the world is the opposite of an ambiguous figure. It's an unambiguous figure, right? And hence the lack of ambiguity between the fox and the hedgehog, and that lack of ambiguity, right, is the reification of the binary opposition between the two figures, right? Because and the more that the binary division is reiterated as a performative act in a culture, right? Boy, girl, day, night. The more the figure ground, hedgehog, fox, the more that the binary opposition is reiterated, as a contrastive rather than ambiguously useful and comparative figure, the more that the difference and the structural opposition as a cognitive imperative, right, is reified within the culture and the cultural values. So with every repetition of fox and hedgehog is also a performative reification, right? So in Gertrude Stein, right? If you like take let's do what appears to be non sequitur, conceptual non sequitur to the repetitions that appear in Gertrude Stein, right? Repetition, she says, and at some point she seems to question the very ontological stability of repetition. There is no repetition. There's only emphasis, and in emphasis you could say, right, there's a kind of reification. So you're underscoring. So the act of repeating underscores. In oppositions, conceptual oppositions that belong to high levels of discourse as well as legal discourse, every repetition is a performative reification, right? And so gender binaries. Let's take gender in language. Well, clearly nouns don't have gender, right? But in language they're provided gender, and the repetition of the grammatical structure and the grammatical categories within the language, gives rise in the mind to an idea and an understanding that, somehow maybe in the word poem, whether in that language it's identified as, if the language has gender, if it's identified as a masculine or feminine word, that there's something inherently masculine or feminine about the poem, right? And that's the reification of this idea, right? To at the level of the grammatical categorization itself. Now, the closer, right, that these concepts come to embodying a stability within the conceptual universe that language organized, the more the repetition, the more performative. What's the word I'm looking for? The more efficacious, right, the performativity becomes, and the more reified the object becomes. And the reason that it relates to Rorschach tests is because the way that the system of interpreting and hermeneuticizing the interpretation of the values assigned by the psychological subject to the objects in the world, right, that's a highly codified and highly authorized, right, understanding of the way that the psychological subject is interpreted within, a series of values that are based on taking an ambiguous figure that doesn't exist here and turning it into either a fox or a hedgehog, right? And because it does so under conditions of authority, and that authority is to assign, values to the psychological subject, abnormal, normal, bipolar, schizophrenic, whatever other values that the one who is given the authority to uncode the two sets of time have, then the more that this subject can be reified. The subject is reified within the term set up by the cultural binary, precisely because the binary belongs to these domains, right, of intellectual and political authority that can make these determinations. Now, in coming back to the piece, I wanted to ask some questions, but I'm running out of time, and I won't be able to ask them here. But one of the questions that I wanted to ask was why was Wittgenstein interested in these ambiguous figures in the first place? And I think I hinted at that when I hinted at the fact that I wanted to ask these questions. Now here Bach is not Johann Sebastian Bach, and here Blake is not William Blake. But it becomes interesting that we can take the authors of these pieces because of other reference that their names have, and that we can imagine somewhere in this discourse, in this text, Bach playing in the background, and perhaps a William Blake poem being read along the side, or perhaps elsewhere, like in the advertisements or something. But the question of why Wittgenstein was interested in these types of ambiguous figures, I think is relevant. And I would argue that I don't have a window open for this, but I would argue that it grows out of his early relationship with Bertrand Russell, who in many ways was an individual acting, in the entirety of his philosophy, as Isaiah Berlin is acting here in the distribution of individuals in the world into categories of hedgehogs and foxes, and Russell was interested in the symbolic values of language as a kind of classification system in logic. I think it was Russell who said, there are no philosophical problems, just problems of language. And he's very much interested in these kind of ways of organizing conceptions as sets, Venn diagrams, and all kinds of figural representations of the way that the mind works. And if you read his The Wisdom of the West, which is like it's almost like a children's book, or philosophy as a children's book, it has all of these sort of cognitive graphic representations of concepts, like Venn diagrams, but other kinds of diagrammatic representations of relationships between objects and sets and ideas, and this kind of abstracted logic that possessed his work was, I think in many ways what Wittgenstein was struggling to get out of and get away from, and what his construct of language game was very successful at working toward getting around. And so it was ambiguous figures like this that can be perceived of as representations of, this could be a cube with this particular face facing forward, right? Or it can be perceived of this would be the forward surface facing us as a viewer, or this can be perceived as the forward surface, and it's in both instances a transparent cube. Same here. This can be perceived as a three-dimensional object. This is the three-dimensional object, or this is the three-dimensional object, and this is the two-dimensional background wall. In this case, this is the three-dimensional object here, and this is the two-dimensional. You get the idea. But these perceptual phenomenon, right, were in some ways metaphors for conceptual phenomenon, and so they didn't strictly belong to I believe for Wittgenstein to categories of Gestalt psychology, or that would relate to this idea of op art, but all of these were metaphors for cognition, and the ambiguities and instabilities of categories like this, and the way that questions of, say, the aleatory and could potentially come into procedural relationships in acts of communication, and the way that anything that in fact belong to the physical universe could enter into the dynamics of intentionality by saying it so. In the same way that, Marcel Duchamp says that his urinal or his bicycle wheel are art, we have stated that that the views, of our YouTube videos are acts of communication. Now, this of course can be ignored or rejected, and one can say, no, I looked at your piece, and I had no intention of communicating with you by my number of views, and I don't know your space-time system coordinate machines, and I don't use them. Well, you can choose to do that, and you can choose not to recognize Duchamp's, bicycle wheel or urinal as works of art. But in doing so, you'll still engage in a communication with Duchamp. He has said yes, and you have said no. So even failing, to acknowledge the construct, right, of observation as communication is an act of communication with it. So it's inescapable in that sense, and again represents an aspect of the intellectual modality of the communicative visual that if we were assigned values to Jacobson's model, right, would problematize almost every element of not problematize in the sense of abandon, but I should have said, complicate, right? Everything becomes an and/or. There either is one sender or there is one plus sender or one minus sender, meaning that the sender can be the same as the receiver in a certain sense or have analogous characteristics that belong to the sending and the receiving. I'm assuming that consciousness, even if it belongs to the physical and material reality of a single individual, is already multiple and diverse. And so as a receiver, we're always sending ourselves messages. And that could be a loop, a simple loop that sends us back to the endpoint, as in the designation number, right? As in the designation number in the space-time travel set, 441 itself, right? So imagine that this is the receiver. This is our message. The receiver is already in play. We send it back into the system. This becomes our new destination. We're back here, right? It's a short loop, right, between the destiny and the course and the channel. So, in terms of Jacobson's functions, we have a system that was created through a channel, which exists in space and time, that involved 4 leaps. Let's say that in that particular message context, all 4 leaps hadn't been made. The message itself tells us to make another leap back to the message itself. But in doing so, we can imagine that any one of these, right, any one of these levels can do the same thing. That at the receiver level, we could be sending a message merely back to ourselves. At the sender level, we could be sending a message back to ourselves. Context could merely be the context of the message itself. You see what I'm saying? So, opening up the model to time, right, creates variabilities in the way that loops can function. Either loops at short loops, right, very short loops, larger loops, full loops. Let's just imagine that I'm touching all of the things. Linearities, right? Okay, let's imagine that in linearities there are 2 sets of linearities. Here's a displacement, right? In terms of, and when I say the word displacement, in this instance I'm using the word displacement as the shortest distance between 2 points, a line, right? So if we add time and space, we can understand that there are not only loops, and these loops can be variable, but we start to understand that there can be directions and directionalities, and these directions and directionalities can be displacements or vectors. They can be vectors running in both directions at the same time, even within the construct of displacement, or they can be what I've referred to before as rambles. They can be passages that move in arcs and curves. Let's say I wanted to avoid this, and we've done this variously in the discourse that I'm producing today, where I said I'm not going to talk about that because we don't have time. So, like, say there's a police station in your neighborhood, and you belong to a positionality, whatever that positionality is, that society systemically oppresses, and that is systemically biased against or toward, right? So you don't really want to walk by the police station on your walk to the park, right? So say that say that this is the police station and this is the park. So your ramble can go like this. And there can be a political reason for the ramble, or there can be a matter of time. You know that this is going to take you a lot of time to cross for whatever reason. Let's say it's part of the discourse. We don't want to deal with that today because it either appears to be a digression or a non sequitur, even though it's not a non sequitur, but it appears to be, because today we're talking about yellow and blue things, and this is not. This appears to be a magenta thing, or maybe it's a red, or maybe it's something else, but we don't have time to do that today. Or maybe this is something that holds memories that are difficult to deal with, and we don't want to get emotionally involved with that today, so we take a ramble. There are a lot of different ways to go, or maybe we just really want to take a long walk, and this is too short, right? So within space-time communication coordinate systems, there are loops that belong to all of the categories. There are loops that belong to some of the categories. There are loops that we can create with selected categories. There are rambles that we can make. There are displacements, and I don't know if we can make displacements going this way. We can make displacements. We can rearrange, right? We can rearrange the model. We can put context and channel and code in some sort of linear relationship to one another. We don't have to stick with this. All of these things that we can do, that Russell wouldn't probably like us doing, but that Wittgenstein would have found amusing, right? And not identified with his ambiguous figures necessarily, but would have identified with other types of language games that can be performed and that in fact are performed all of the time with intelligent entities that utilize language.